March 1943. The icy air above the Kuban River trembles with the sound of engines. At barely 1,000 meters, a formation of sleek, unfamiliar fighters slices through the haze. They are not the famed Yaks or the deadly Lavochkins the Germans have come to expect. They are American, Bell P-39 Airacobras, aircraft the United States once dismissed as failures. Below them, the Black Sea glints like polished steel. Above, German Messerschmitts dive to intercept. The lead Soviet pilot, Guards Captain Aleksandr Pokryshkin, locks eyes on his prey, his voice steady over the radio. His order cuts through the static. Attack together. The Airacobras roll sharply, diving low, turning impossibly tight, their 37mm cannons thundering. 2 Messerschmitts vanish in flame. By the time the dogfight ends, the impossible has happened. The Luftwaffe has been outflown by American-built fighters in Soviet hands. And yet, back in Washington and London, those same aircraft were already being written off as obsolete. How did the world's worst fighter become the weapon that helped the Soviets reclaim the skies? To answer that, we must go back to the moment it was born. The Bell P-39 Airacobra began not as a battlefield miracle, but as a compromise. In 1937, the United States Army Air Corps issued a radical requirement: a high-altitude interceptor capable of defending American cities and coastlines. Bell Aircraft, a relatively young company, led by visionary engineer Larry Bell, proposed something unconventional: a fighter with its engine placed behind the pilot, a tricycle landing gear for stability, and a 37mm cannon firing through the propeller hub. It looked futuristic, fast, sleek, deadly. But its heart, the turbo-supercharged Allison engine, was the key. It allowed the Airacobra to climb high, fight bombers at 30,000 feet, and intercept threats before they reached the mainland. That was the plan. Then the compromises began. In 1939, with war already raging in Europe, the Army stripped away the turbo supercharger, a costly, complex system few engineers fully trusted. It was replaced with a simpler engine configuration, optimized for low-altitude operation. On paper, the change saved weight and maintenance time. In practice, it crippled the P-39's ability to fight at altitude. The result was an aircraft that looked fast but gasped for breath above 12,000 feet, precisely where air combat over Europe and the Pacific would later take place. When the United States entered the war, the Airacobra went to squadrons in Britain and the Pacific. British pilots quickly discovered its flaws. Its climb rate was poor, its range limited, and at high altitudes it was sluggish and unstable. Reports were scathing, unsuitable for European operations. In the Pacific, American pilots fared little better, fighting agile Japanese Zeros above 20,000 feet. The P-39's weaknesses were laid bare. By late 1942, the aircraft was being withdrawn from frontline American units. On paper, it had failed, but history was about to take an unexpected turn. Thousands of P-39s had already rolled off American assembly lines, a logistical momentum too great to halt. With new fighters like the P-38 Lightning and P-47 Thunderbolt entering production, the Airacobra was destined for second-line duties or foreign transfer. And then came a request, not from London or Washington, but from Moscow. The Soviet Union, struggling to hold back the German advance, desperately needed modern aircraft. Under the Lend-Lease program, the United States offered them what was available. Among crates of vehicles, trucks, and spare parts stood hundreds of crated Airacobras, unwanted in the West, but ready to fly. When the first shipment arrived at Soviet ports via Alaska and Iran, expectations were low. Even American advisors doubted the aircraft would survive Russia's brutal conditions. But the Soviets saw something others did not. They studied its structure, the mid-engine balance that gave exceptional roll control. They noticed the thick armor around the cockpit, perfect for surviving ground fire. They examined the massive 37mm cannon, ideal for destroying enemy bombers and ground targets. This was not a high-altitude interceptor. It was a close-range, heavy-hitting, low-altitude fighter, exactly what the Eastern Front demanded. By 1942, Soviet engineers were modifying the Airacobra for their needs. They stripped excess weight, removed wing guns to improve maneuverability, and tuned engines for low-altitude performance. They redefined the aircraft's role entirely, from failed interceptor to lethal frontline hunter. While Western pilots scorned it, Soviet pilots began to master it. The Airacobra's sturdy frame thrived on rough airfields. Its cannon could shatter German bombers in a single burst, and its excellent radio equipment, far superior to Soviet-built sets, allowed for coordinated formations and precise tactics. Slowly, the transformation began. By early 1943, the Airacobra had become the backbone of several elite Soviet air regiments, including the 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment. These were the units that would change the balance of air power on the Eastern Front, and at their head stood Aleksandr Pokryshkin, a pilot whose name would become legend, and whose mastery of the Airacobra would rewrite everything the world thought it knew about America's worst fighter. By 1943, the Soviet Air Force, the VVS, was in transformation. Just 2 years earlier, its pilots had faced the Luftwaffe with outdated biplanes, inadequate training, and almost no radios. German Messerschmitt Bf-109s dominated the skies, while Soviet pilots fought desperately, often guided by visual signals or colored flares from the ground. But the war was forcing evolution at breakneck speed. The Soviet aircraft industry was producing newer designs, like the Yak-1 and La-5, while training programs were growing more rigorous. Yet one thing the Red Air Force still lacked was a truly versatile, robust, and well-equipped fighter to fill the gap between interceptors and ground attack planes. That's where the P-39 Airacobra entered the story, an aircraft written off in the West, reborn in the East. The Soviets quickly realized that the Airacobra's weaknesses at high altitude didn't matter much in their war. On the Eastern Front, most combat took place below 15,000 feet. The altitude of German bomber runs, tank convoys, and frontline support operations. At these levels, the Airacobra's Allison engine performed beautifully. Its mid-engine design gave it superb balance, allowing pilots to make tight turns and sudden dives with precision. The 37mm cannon, too heavy and slow-firing for Western pilots, became a devastating weapon in Soviet hands. A single shell could rip through a German bomber or destroy a tank's engine from above. Soviet mechanics also began customizing the aircraft. They removed unnecessary wing guns to reduce weight and improve roll rate. They stripped off some armor plates and fine-tuned propeller pitch for faster response. Each modification made the plane more agile, more Russian in spirit. What truly revolutionized Soviet air tactics, however, wasn't the aircraft's firepower, it was its radio. For the first time, Soviet fighter formations could communicate clearly and instantly. Western pilots took this for granted, but to the Red Air Force, it was transformative. Coordination that once required hand signals and guesswork now became precise and deadly. A squadron of P-39s could act like a single organism, maneuvering in layered formations, ambushing German bombers, and covering each other with perfect timing. The man who perfected this style of combat was Aleksandr Pokryshkin, a pilot of exceptional intelligence and daring. Born in 1913 in Nikolaevsk, now Novosibirsk, Pokryshkin began the war flying obsolete MiG-3s, a high-altitude fighter ill-suited to the chaotic low-level battles of the Eastern Front. After surviving early defeats and witnessing the near destruction of his unit, he vowed never again to fight by outdated doctrine. When he first sat in the cockpit of an American P-39 in 1942, Pokryshkin instantly understood its potential. The visibility, the firepower, the responsiveness, everything suited the kind of combat he envisioned: coordinated, aggressive, and tactical. He began developing a set of innovative doctrines, later known as the Pokryshkin formula, built around teamwork and altitude layering. Instead of sending all fighters at once, Pokryshkin divided his squadrons into altitude tiers. One flight engaged the enemy directly, another positioned above to cover them, and a third waited at even higher altitude to intercept escaping aircraft. Every move was controlled by radio. Every attack was deliberate. This system allowed smaller Soviet groups to defeat larger German formations, a reversal of what had defined air combat since 1941. The results came quickly. In spring 1943, during the battles around Kuban, Pokryshkin's regiment, flying P-39s, achieved kill ratios the Soviets had never seen before. German bombers and fighters fell from the sky in droves. Luftwaffe intelligence began to take notice. Reports from frontline German units described American fighters with red stars, executing coordinated ambushes at low altitude, striking with terrifying precision. The Airacobras' reputation was changing. What had been called a failure by the US and Britain was now feared on the Eastern Front. Pokryshkin's personal tally climbed rapidly. By mid-1943, he had scored over 30 victories, many of them in the P-39. But what truly mattered was not his individual success. It was the transformation of the Soviet Air Force around him. His doctrine spread to other regiments. Training manuals began to emphasize radio communication, coordinated flights, and altitude discipline. The P-39 became both a symbol and a tool of this new approach. By late 1943, Soviet factories were churning out improved domestic fighters like the Yak-9 and La-7, but even then, the Airacobra remained beloved by the pilots who flew it. It was forgiving, rugged, and deadly in the right hands. The transformation of the Eastern Front's air war had begun, and the P-39 Airacobra, dismissed as America's worst fighter, had become one of Stalin's most valuable weapons. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would cement the Airacobra's unexpected legacy: the Battle of the Kuban, where Soviet pilots would prove beyond doubt that context, not design, determines victory. Every great war machine becomes a legend, not through its blueprints, but through the people and doctrines that shape its destiny. The P-39 Airacobra's journey from American failure to Soviet triumph can be understood through several defining angles: human, tactical, technological, and psychological. At the heart of the Airacobra's success were men who refused to see limits. Aleksandr Pokryshkin stood at the center of this transformation. A strategist wrapped in a pilot's uniform, his leadership went beyond flying skill. He reprogrammed the mindset of Soviet aviation. In his hands, the P-39 was not just a machine, it was an idea. Pokryshkin taught his pilots that survival and success came from thought, not instinct. He broke the Soviet taboo against improvisation. He encouraged critical thinking in combat, analyzing the enemy's behavior, planning ambushes, and using speed and altitude to manipulate the fight. He often reminded his men: height, speed, maneuver, fire. These are your 4 friends." Other aces followed his example. Grigory Rechkolov, Pokryshkin's comrade, achieved more than 50 confirmed kills, many in the P-39. Nikolai Gulayev and Dmitry Glenka also rose to fame with the same aircraft, mastering its balance and gunnery to deadly effect. They learned to treat the Airacobra like an extension of their bodies. Knowing exactly when to dive, how to exploit its tight turning radius, and how to use its central cannon for devastating short bursts. This bond between pilot and plane wasn't just skill, it was trust. Soviet pilots trusted the Airacobra to bring them home, even after brutal dogfights. It could take hits, lose cylinders, and still limp back to base. That resilience earned it a rare kind of loyalty. To these men, the P-39 was not America's mistake. It was their weapon, and their revenge for 1941. The transformation of the P-39's reputation wasn't only about brave pilots. It was about revolutionary tactics. Pokryshkin's methods became doctrine. His squadrons fought in structured layers, maintaining altitude separation and mutual cover. The P-39's radio made it possible. Each pilot knew his role, attacker, cover, or high guard, and could respond instantly to changes. This was a fundamental shift from early Soviet chaos, where communication often meant colored flares or hand signals. Under the new system, dogfights became orchestrated battles. Instead of individual duels, Soviet fighters moved like packs of wolves, coordinated, precise, relentless. They used hit-and-run tactics when outnumbered, luring German fighters into traps. Pokryshkin's unit would dive in to attack bombers, then climb rapidly while another section pounced on the escorting Bf-109s from above. The P-39's excellent acceleration at medium altitude made this tactic brutally effective. The Luftwaffe, used to dominating Soviet skies with superior coordination, suddenly faced opponents who could match or outthink them. Pokryshkin's radio-guided formations began appearing everywhere from the Kuban to Kursk. Each encounter tested and refined the system, pushing Soviet air doctrine closer to modern air combat strategy. The Airacobra was not the fastest or most powerful aircraft, but it was synchronized warfare in metallic form. Western criticism of the P-39 centered on one issue: its lack of a turbocharger. The Allison V-1710 engine performed poorly above 15,000 feet, limiting its usefulness in Europe or the Pacific, where air battles often occurred at high altitude. But the Soviets didn't fight that kind of war. Their front was low, close, and brutal. Tank battles, troop movements, river crossings, and artillery lines. At those altitudes, the Airacobra's engine performed perfectly. The mid-engine layout, which had confused American mechanics, gave the aircraft incredible balance and reduced drag in tight turns. Its tricycle landing gear made takeoff smoother on rough Soviet airfields. And then, there was the weapon. The 37mm M4 cannon firing through the propeller hub. This single, massive weapon was what made the P-39 unique. Western pilots complained about its slow rate of fire, but the Soviets saw opportunity. One hit was enough. Against German bombers, it was a sky-borne hammer. Against tanks, it was a sniper rifle. Pokryshkin himself destroyed armored vehicles during low-level strafing runs using that cannon. The P-39's durability also impressed Soviet engineers. The aircraft could absorb punishment and still fly. Mechanics loved its simplicity. No complex supercharger, straightforward systems, and easy-to-swap parts. It was practical warfare technology, made by Americans, perfected by Soviets. By 1943, the Soviet Union was desperate for morale victories. The ground war was bloody, the human cost staggering. The P-39 arrived not only as a weapon, but as a symbol of progress, an aircraft that could match the enemy and prove Soviet skill on equal terms. Pilots who mastered it became national heroes. Pokryshkin's name filled Soviet newspapers. His regiment's victories were broadcast to every corner of the country. The message was clear. The Red Air Force could now stand toe-to-toe with the Luftwaffe. This morale boost was enormous. Every successful sortie carried political weight. The Airacobra wasn't just fighting for air superiority. It was fighting for belief. At a time when Soviet soldiers on the ground faced overwhelming odds, hearing that their comrades in the sky were shooting down Messerschmitts with American-built machines gave hope. Even Stalin himself took note. The P-39's effectiveness, combined with Pokryshkin's leadership, became a showcase of Soviet adaptability. In propaganda films and reports, the aircraft was rebranded as a fighter of victory. It was an irony lost on few. The same plane that the U.S. Air Force dismissed as a failure had become a cornerstone of Soviet pride. And in this mixture of skill, adaptation, and psychology, the legend of the Airacobra solidified. But the true test of this transformation would come in the crucible of the Kuban air battles, a campaign that would decide whether the P-39's success was real or a lucky illusion. Every aircraft is born with a purpose. The tragedy or triumph of its legacy depends entirely on whether that purpose matches the war it fights. The Bell P-39 Airacobra was designed for a war that never came, a high-speed interceptor defending American coasts from bombers that never appeared. Its design made sense on the drawing board: a streamlined fuselage, a 37mm cannon, and a mid-mounted engine for aerodynamic balance. But when the U.S. Army Air Forces entered World War II, they needed long-range, high-altitude escort fighters, something the Airacobra simply wasn't built to be. Its lack of a turbocharger doomed it above 15,000 feet. Its range couldn't protect bombers over Germany. In the Pacific, it couldn't chase Japanese Zeros across vast distances. So, in Western service, it failed. But in the East, the war was fought at different altitudes, over different distances, and with different goals. The Soviets didn't need a long-range escort fighter. They needed a front-line hunter. They needed something that could climb fast, hit hard, and fight dirty in the turbulent air above tank battles and artillery lines. The P-39 was perfect for that. When the first Lend-Lease shipments arrived through Iran and Alaska, Soviet engineers tested the aircraft, shrugged at its altitude limitations, and realized something Western analysts hadn't. This machine was made for their war. In a sense, the Airacobra didn't change to fit the Soviets. The Soviets changed their tactics to unleash. The Airacobra, that single strategic alignment between machine and mission, turned a failed aircraft into a war-winning one. It's a timeless lesson in military design. Success isn't about perfection, it's about fit. Behind every ace and every dogfight stood an invisible army of mechanics, transport pilots, and engineers who kept the P-39 alive. The Lend-Lease program was an immense logistical operation. Ships carried aircraft in crates to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, while others took the Alaska-Siberia route, a chain of icy airfields stretching from Great Falls, Montana, through Canada, Alaska, and across Siberia to the front. Each aircraft's journey was an odyssey. American ferry pilots flew them to Fairbanks. From there, Soviet pilots took over, navigating across frozen tundra and mountain ranges. Dozens were lost en route to weather, mechanical failure, or navigation errors. But those that made it were immediately put to use. Soviet ground crews developed a reputation for speed. A newly arrived Airacobra could be uncrated, reassembled, and flight-ready in under 48 hours. Mechanics removed unnecessary equipment, like British radios and armor plating, to reduce weight. They adjusted engines for local fuel. They repainted them with Soviet markings and deployed them to the front. It was an extraordinary cycle of adaptation, a global chain linking American industry, Arctic logistics, and Soviet battlefield innovation. By 1945, over 4,700 P-39s had reached the USSR, more than half of all Airacobras ever built. And unlike other Lend-Lease aircraft, the P-39 wasn't treated as a secondary option. It became the frontline fighter of the Red Air Force. That logistical success story is often forgotten, but it shaped history. Without that supply chain, Pokryshkin's regiment would never have existed. Without those aircraft, the air battles over Kursk might have looked very different. The Airacobra wasn't just an airplane, it was a bridge of steel, oil, and courage, spanning continents. By late 1943, Luftwaffe intelligence began noticing a strange pattern. Reports from the Eastern Front spoke of American-built aircraft flown by Russians, agile, heavily armed, and increasingly lethal. At first, German pilots dismissed them as second-rate machines. After all, they knew the P-39's reputation from the West. They considered it clumsy and slow. But as the months passed, losses began to rise. Squadrons of P-39s, flying in disciplined formations, began to challenge German air superiority over the Kuban and Kursk. Veteran Luftwaffe pilots who once boasted of easy victories now faced ambushes from invisible foes. Soviet radar and radio coordination, once primitive, were now matching German precision. The P-39's distinctive engine note became a warning sound. The Germans even gave it a nickname, Die Schraubennatter, the screw serpent. Some German aces began refusing to engage P-39 formations unless they had altitude advantage. Others grew cautious, aware that a single 37mm shell could destroy even an FW-190 in one hit. The shift wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. For the first time, the Luftwaffe no longer felt invincible. That fear, quiet, creeping, and cumulative, was one of the Airacobra's greatest victories. By the time the war ended, the P-39 had achieved what few expected. It had become one of the most successful foreign aircraft in Soviet history. It produced dozens of aces, including 3 who became heroes of the Soviet Union multiple times. Pokryshkin alone scored 47 victories in the P-39, making him the top Allied ace flying an American-built fighter. The Soviets continued flying Airacobras long after victory, until 1949. By then, jet fighters had replaced propellers, but the lessons endured. The P-39 taught generations of commanders a crucial principle. It's not about having the best machine. It's about understanding how to use what you have. That lesson extended far beyond aviation. It shaped Soviet doctrine in the Cold War, influencing how they approached tanks, missiles, and even space technology. And in the West, post-war analysts struggled to explain the contradiction. How could the same aircraft fail in one theater and triumph in another? The uncomfortable truth was this: success was never in the machine. It was in the match between mission and mindset. Today, when people walk through aviation museums, they often pass by the Airacobra with little notice. It stands beside giants like the Spitfire and Mustang, aircraft celebrated for their beauty and but if you listen closely, the Airacobra has a quieter story to tell. It's a story about redemption, about a misunderstood design finding its purpose in the hands of those who believed in it. To Soviet veterans, it wasn't a flawed American export. It was a symbol of survival, a machine that met them halfway, that gave them a fighting chance when hope was thin. Every bolt, every scratch, every patch of worn green paint tells that story. The Airacobra reminds us that history isn't written by perfection. It's written by persistence. If you've made it this far, you're one of the few who truly appreciate the hidden stories behind history's headlines. The P-39 Airacobra's journey, from failure to legend, proves that context, courage, and creativity can transform anything. If you want to see more stories like this, tales of forgotten machines, unlikely heroes, and lessons that still matter today, subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment sharing where you're watching from, and like this video so it reaches others who love history as much as you do. Because history isn't just what happened, it's what we choose to remember. Stay curious, stay inspired, and see you in the next story.